Hey everyone, I'm just reading a book review by Alan Johnson of the edited volume The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Texts of Critical Marxism, Volume 1, edited by Sean Matgamna, and the book Neither Capitalism Nor Socialism, Theories of Bureaucratic Collectivism, edited by Ernest E. Haberkern and Arthur Lipow. In April 1940, the National Convention of the American Socialist Workers' Party, the most important Trotskyist group in the world, split in two over the quote Russian question, end quote. Albert Goldman, Trotsky's attorney during the 1937 Dewey Commission into the Moscow trials, was the spokesman for the majority faction. Quote, private property has been nationalized in 1/8 of the world. It is the only thing concrete left in the camp of the proletariat. We are not giving up nationalized property for some abstraction of the world revolution, end quote. Albert Goldman. Another majority supporter, Richardson from Oakland, said, quote, just imagine if Stalin did set up a bureaucracy in India. What a tremendous advance it would be over the present democracy, end quote. Goldman defended Richardson's speech with the argument that, quote, between the slavery of a degenerated worker state and the slavery of capitalism, we prefer the slavery of a degenerated worker state, end quote. Goldman. Convention minutes taken by the minority indicates that at this point there broke out, quote, applause from the majority side, hissing from the minority side, end quote. These two edited collections end quote. These two edited editions make easily accessible for the first time the viewpoint of the minority who went on to form the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League from 1940 to 1958. These were revolutionary democratic socialists whose politics were summed up in the slogan, neither Washington nor Moscow, but the third camp of independent socialism. Writing in 1963, Hal Draper made a wide-ranging claim for the political significance of the Workers' Party Workers' Party Independent Socialist League within the I gotta repeat that whole sentence. Writing in 1963, Hal Draper made a wide-ranging claim for the political significance of the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League within the revolutionary Marxist tradition, while noting the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League's origins in the, quote, Russian question, end quote, of 1939 to 40, Draper went on to claim that the Independent Socialist League had subsequently achieved nothing less than the preservation and development of the idea of socialism from below in the post-war world, forging a, quote, revolutionary democratic socialism for our time, end quote. Quote, the political character of the Independent Socialist League quickly broadened from this war position to a wide reinterpretation of the meaning of revolutionary socialism for our day. Reacting sharply against the bureaucratic concepts of both official Trotskyism and official Stalinism, it swung to a deep-going analysis on the integration of socialism and democracy in all aspects of politics. What was distinctive, however, was that this was accompanied by equally sharp opposition to the American establishment, to American imperialism, to capitalism and capitalism's political representatives here. What resulted was a unique combination of revolutionary opposition to both capitalism and communism, end quote. Communism in capital C. Hal Draper, 1963. The arguments of the third camp tradition remain largely unknown to contemporary Marxists. The Workers' Party Independent Socialist League tradition has been paid scant attention. The interest has concentrated almost exclusively on the luminaries who passed through it, from the various New York intellectuals associated with partisan review to figures such as James Burnham, Irving Kristol, Seymour Martin, Lipset, Dwight MacDonald, C.L.R. James, Raya Dunayevskaya, Irving Howe, and Michael Harrington. The glare given off by such stars has blinded commentators to the core of the tradition around Max Shachtman and Hal Draper. Peter Drucker's recent study of Max Shachtman is the first serious attempt from within the Trotskyist tradition to reassess the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League. It is now joined by these two important collections of reprints: The Fate of the Russian Revolution, Lost Texts in Critical Marxism, collects many of the writings of Max Shachtman, a founder of American Trotskyism, an international executive committee member of the Fourth International, and the most important theoretician it possessed after Trotsky. Alongside 37 articles by Shachtman are 4 from James Burnham, 3 from Trotsky, and 2 each by Hal Draper and C.L.R. James. Matgamna also offers a superb book-length analysis of Trotsky's own evolving position from his expulsion from the Soviet Union in 1929 to his murder by Stalin's agent in Mexico in 1940, and of the development of Trotskyism after the Second World War. Footnote: the Matgamna collection presents a somewhat airbrushed Max Shachtman. In a book of over 600 pages of close type, Matgamna has cut around 3,000 words of Joseph Carter's theoretical critique of Shachtman's version of bureaucratic collectivism. Fortunately, Carter's critique is printed in full and its significance explored in the Haberkern Lipow collection. Matgamna is overly defensive about Shachtman's rightward trajectory in the 1950s and 1960s, arguing that, quote, Shachtman's machinations to find a road forwards for the mass labor movement were bracket not end bracket necessarily discreditable, end quote, and were better than, quote, dawdling in sectarian aloofness, end quote, a comment, I suspect, on Hal Draper's opposition. But not the least of Shachtman's, quote, crimes, end quote, was that if the Independent Socialist League could have held out for a few more years, it could have been floated off the beach by the rising tide of the New Left. The International Socialist League Youth Group was anything but aloof and sectarian, and would have been extremely well placed to grow in the 1960s, possibly even challenging the students for a democratic society. Instead, it was left to Draper to hack out a third-camp political tendency more or less from scratch against Shachtman's bitter opposition amid the tumult of the 1960s. End footnote. Neither capitalism nor socialism, Theories of Bureaucratic Collectivism, edited by Ernest E. Haberkern and Arthur Lipow, reprint 13 key texts of bureaucratic collectivist theory written between 1937 and 1951 by James Burnham, Joseph Carter, Max Shachtman, Ivan Crépieux, Hal Draper, Jack Brad, Ernest Erber, and Dwight MacDonald. If Matgamna's claim to have unearthed the, quote, Dead Sea Scrolls of revolutionary Marxism, end quote, is a little hyperbolic, Haberkern and Lipow are correct that these texts remain a, quote, necessary prerequisite for understanding what happened to, quote, socialism, end quote, in the 20th century, end quote. The editorial line of both collections is that the third camp tradition of the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League laid the theoretical foundation stone for a democratic revolutionary Marxism in the epoch of Stalinism, while upon the rotten foundation of the juridical illusion in nationalized property was built a totalitarian economism, a disastrous accommodation of socialism, its orthodox Trotskyist variant included, with Stalinism. The, quote, Russian question, end quote, encoded a debate about the very meaning of socialism, specifically the respective places of democracy, workers' political power, and nationalized property in a workers' state and a socialist society. Both collections begin where they have to with the critique of Trotsky. The critique of Trotsky. In 1939, when the Soviet Union invaded Poland and Finland, Trotsky made the catastrophic argument that Russia remained a, quote, workers' state, end quote, because nationalized property was in and of itself a form of, quote, proletarian economy, end quote. Consequently, Russia's wars in Poland and Finland, the wars of a workers' state, should be defended. Trotsky insisted that the Stalinist invasion of Poland, quote, gave an impulse to the socialist revolution through bureaucratic methods, end quote, and in Finland, the, quote, Red, end quote, army was giving a, quote, tremendous impulse to the class struggle in its sharpest form, end quote, the Kremlin being, quote, forced to provoke a social revolutionary movement, end quote. Caught in the theoretical logic of the, quote, worker state, end quote, position, Trotsky gave birth to the idea of the bureaucratic proletarian revolution led by Stalinists to be supported for now as a distorted expression of a locum or substitute for, quote, the revolution, end quote. Henceforth, Orthodox Trotskyists would be left trying to reason within the terms of Trotsky's prior revolt against reason and would project locums within locums, endowing these with the qualities of the revolutionary proletariat. Thus, Michael Louvy, in his account of the, quote, proletarian socialist revolutions, end quote, of Tito, Mao, and Ho, saw not Stalinist formations, embryos of the new exploitative ruling class, but fantastically parties which, quote, acted as, quote, representatives, end quote, of the, quote, proletariat, nothing less than the, quote, political and programmatic expression of the proletariat by virtue of their adherence to the historical interest of the working class, the abolition of capitalism, etc., end quote, parties whose, quote, ideologies were proletarian, end quote. Just a moment to pause here. I'm not a Trotskyist myself, but I am deeply interested in third camp Trotskyism. And one of the things that's interesting is because, I'm coming from more of a, my interests, at least, lie more with the libertarian communist tradition associated with council communism. But it's important to note that there's a book recently that came out with PM Press talking about how, there should be like a reunion, wedding of Marxism and anarchism by Michael Louvy. Now, granted, and it seems to me that Michael Louvy's not even on the libertarian side, the most democratic side at least of the Trotskyist movement. Obviously, he has good things to say about anarchism, which is awesome, and I fully support it. And he has good things to say about a lot of things, but I think that there's better representatives. It should be noted that there are probably more compatible representatives within Trotskyism than Michael Louvy, and I think some of the left of the Shachtmanism, represented by Hal Draper, and embodied in the politics of journals such as New Politics, are way more compatible with a libertarian perspective than Michael Louvy. Also, in the this is an old book, but in the I think it's called The Theory of Revolution in the Young Karl Marx, Michael Louvy pretty consistently shits maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm not remembering this correctly, and maybe it was only a few times, but it seems like there's a couple times, with at least a couple times in the book. I'll say that it happens in the book. I don't know how large of a theme it is, but a big part of something that struck out to me is his, he's more or less just like shitting on the libertarian Marxist Marxologist in France, Maximilien Rubel. Um, I don't exactly recall what, but yeah. In addition, it seems like, yeah. I'll just keep going. Ernest Mandel, who for 20 years, with no qualifications, defined Mao's China as a, quote, workers' state, argued that, quote, the Chinese Communist Party was striving to destroy capitalism and therefore represented a fundamentally proletarian social force, end quote. Oh shit, there was a footnote after the Louvy thing. That quote was from Ernest Mandel. Okay, here's the footnote. Livy suggested that the orthodox Trotskyist, quote, who continues to claim that the Communist Party is a working class party in spite of all the reason that it directs its appeal to the working class so that it uses the working class as a base of operations, end quote, might be reminded of the lines from the Communist Manifesto in which Marx pours scorn on, quote, feudal socialism, end quote. When the aristocracy, quote, in order to rally the people to save them, waves a proletarian alms bag in front of a banner, end quote. Marx fully expected the proletariat to look past the alms bags and seeing, quote, on bracket the aristocracy's end bracket hindquarters, the old feudal coat of arms, desert, quote, with loud and irreverent laughter, end quote. The tragedy of texts like Louvy's is that the bureaucracy's, quote, proletarian alms bag, end quote, is theorized, po-faced, as the, quote, political and programmatic expression of the proletariat, end quote, and not from ignorance, but from a position of full knowledge of the barbarities written across its, quote, hindquarters, end quote. Fucking right. That it was also responsible for some of the worst barbarities of the 20th century, such as the famine of 1958 back to the text, he's talking about China. That it was also responsible for some of the worst barbarities of the 20th century, such as the famine of 1958 to 1962, in which 30 million people perished, and a gulag in some ways worse than that of the Soviet Union was for Mandel not decisive. The bureaucracy nationalized property was, however, that the bureaucracy nationalized property was decisive, however. Okay. It's like, what the hell does that sentence mean? Okay. Even Pol Pot's Kampuchea was designated by Mandel as a worker state. Perry Anderson theorized the barbaric worker state, arguing, quote, the iron dictatorship exercised by the Stalinist police administrative apparatus over the Soviet proletariat was not incompatible with the preservation of the proletarian nature of the state itself, any more than ... the fascist dictatorships exercised over the bourgeoisie were with the preservation of the nature of the capitalist state, end quote. Yeah, it's important to keep in mind that the people that are organized around the New Left Review, which would be Perry Anderson and Tariq Ali, were at least I don't know about Perry Anderson actually, so I should be a little more cautious. But were disciples of Ernest Mandel, who was kind of like the main theoretical voice of the Fourth International after the reunification of the International Secretariat and the International Committee under the United Secretariat in, I believe, 1963. Anyway, end quote. Perry Anderson. Alan Woods, theoretician of the militant tendency defending the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, could bracket out the national rights of the Afghans and the necessarily totalitarian dictatorship brought by the invaders because decisively, quote, the Russian bureaucracy is defending new fundamentally progressive social relations, end quote, by which again is meant nationalized property. So the value of these edited collections is twofold. First, they show us the roots of this paradigm shift within revolutionary Marxism. In the 1939-40 split, Matgamna argues that it rendered Marxism a rigid economic necessitarianism and orthodox Trotskyism a, quote, critical adjunct, end quote, of a Stalinist empire embraced as a distorted expression of, quote, the unfolding world revolution, end quote. The so-called workers' states, says Matgamna, were, quote, valued above the lives and liberties of the workers, end quote, with the result that basic Marxist ideas were stood on their head until the mainstream of revolutionary socialism, quote, regressed back behind the political level attained in 1848 at the dawn of Marxism, end quote. Second, both collections trace the revolutionary Marxist position, at least in the United States, to this paradigm shift. For as Hal Draper wrote, it was in resistance to Trotsky that, quote, the third camp was born and raised, end quote. Max Shachtman's reply to Trotsky, Map the Road Not Taken, Democratic, Revolutionary, Humanistic by Orthodox Trotskyism in the second half of the 20th century. Quote, I repeat, I do not believe in the bureaucratic proletarian socialist revolution. I do not mean by this merely that I, quote, have no faith, end quote, in it. No one in our movement has. I mean that I do not consider it possible. I reject the concept not out of, quote, sentimental, end quote, reasons or a Tolstoyan, quote, faith in the people, end quote, but because I believe it to be scientifically correct to repeat with Marx that the emancipation of the working class is the task of the working class itself. The bourgeois revolution, ... could be made and was made by other classes and social strata. The bourgeoisie could be liberated from feudal rule and establish its social dictatorship under the aegis of other social groups. But the proletarian revolution cannot be made by others than the proletariat acting ... No one else can free it, not even for a day, end quote. Hal Draper. Excuse me. Max Shachtman. Jesus Christ. Max Shachtman is what I meant to say. A theoretical pioneer of this third camp or democratic Marxism was Joseph Carter, a founding member of American Trotskyism and a fertile theoretician who did much to educate Hal Draper. Carter was the first fully to grasp that Trotsky's theory was vitiated by, quote, an important methodological error, ... bracket, a failure, end bracket, to give adequate recognition to the decisive qualitative difference between proletarian and bourgeois rule, end quote. Max Shachtman drew out its political significance. Quote, the rule of the proletariat cannot express itself in private ownership of capital, but only in its, quote, ownership, end quote, of the state, in whose hands is concentrated all the decisive economic power. Hence its social power lies in its political power. In bourgeois society, the two can be and are divorced. In the proletarian state, they are inseparable. ... From this ... it follows in reality what does not follow in Trotsky's analysis. The proletariat's relations to property, to the new collectivist property, are indivisibly bound up with its relations to the state, that is, to political power, end quote. Joseph Carter. I have there's an essay by Joseph Carter titled Bureaucratic Collectivism that's on this YouTube channel. Trotsky's notion of, quote, proletarian economy, end quote, Carter pointed out, had no precedent in classical Marxism. The, quote, correct and decisive, end quote, criterion of a worker's state remained whether the working class held political power. While the bourgeoisie can and own and control the means of production without political power, the working class, by contrast, quote, differs from all others in history, above all in the fact that the working class can conquer and rule only in its own name, end quote. Joseph Carter. The theory of, quote, proletarian Bonapartism, end quote, therefore was an absurdity, the result of a failure to understand the qualitative differences between proletarian and bourgeois rule. First, the relation of the juridical and socio-economic in the determination of the class content of the state power is different in the proletarian and bourgeois revolution. While Trotsky thought of, quote, property forms, end quote, and property relations, social relations, as one and the same thing, the minority pointed out that property forms, i.e. nationalized property, were a secondary factor. Primary were property relations, i.e. the relations of the various groups in Russia to this property. The mere fact of nationalized property forms did not establish what the property relations were. What established that was the relationship of people to the state which all property belonged. To define property relations in terms of property forms was to reverse the order of categorical priority, to replace social relations with a juridical illusion, and to substitute an economism for a rounded Marxist judgment. This is actually the juridicalism thing is actually the critique of Trotsky's state capitalism, degenerated worker state thesis as juridical and ignorant of property or social relations in production and in everyday life of people. Maybe the everyday life aspect wouldn't be emphasized by Shachtman or other third campus, but the fact that Trotsky took this very legal formalistic approach to conceptualizing the Soviet Union was very much noted by Cornelius Castoriadis, who called it a form of Proudhonism. The consequence for one's ability as a Marxist theoretically to ground democracy were disastrous. Footnote: the minority critique of, quote, proletarian economism, end quote, is an example, half a century before Lipow, of a comprehensive rejection of economic necessitarianism, which grounds the democratic texture of socialism from a position within, not, quote, post, end quote, Marxism, end footnote. For when the bureaucracy conquered state power, the property relations established by October were by definition destroyed. To imagine that the property relations of October were somehow mystically congealed in the property forms of October, held there intact as long as capitalism was not restored, was a fatal error. The very juridical, quote, illusion, the very, quote, juridical illusion of which Marx warned. Second, the political consequences of the development of Bonapartism are utterly different in the proletariat and bourgeois revolution. While the Bonapartist regime which rules over the bourgeoisie, depriving it of direct political power, has to rule in the interests of the bourgeoisie, despite itself, the regime which emerged to rule in Russia in that act made itself a new ruling class, in and for itself. Shachtman again, quote, where a similar division of labor under capitalism does not transform the economic or political agents of the ruling class into a new class, it does tend to create a new class in a state reposing on collectivized property, that is, in a state which is itself the repository of all social property. End quote, Max Shachtman. Joseph Carter pointed out that far from the working class still ruling despite being enslaved by an iron dictatorship, Bonapartism was diametrically opposite political consequences in the proletarian as compared to the bourgeois revolutions. Not only can the working class not, quote, rule, end quote, economically while remaining enslaved politically, but in collectivized societies, those doing the enslaving must rule, must develop into a new exploitative ruling class. Joseph Carter again, quote, Trotsky defended his new position that the Stalinist state is a workers' state, though the working class had no political power, by citing the bourgeois Bonapartist regime. The analogy would be valid only if the political expropriation of the working class had been accompanied by the strengthening of its economic and social power, its domination over society. Such was the case under all Bonapartist regimes. The political expropriation of the bourgeoisie was accompanied by ... the strengthening of its economic and social power ... But what does the evidence show as regards Russia? Simply this, that the working class has been deprived of all economic and social as well as political power. The strengthening of state property and planning, which allegedly signifies the social rule of the proletariat, resulted in the increased economic, social, and political oppression of the working class. Here is a process which is the exact opposite of what occurs under Bonapartism, end quote. In considering the disastrous theoretical consequences of the theory of, quote, proletarian economy, end quote, Matgamna offers the striking image of the shirt of Nessus. In Greek legend, the shirt soaked by Deianira with the poisonous blood of the centaur Nessus was placed on the back of her husband Heracles. So excruciating was the pain that Heracles had himself burnt on a funeral pyre. Matgamna traces the self-immolation of Trotskyism as a result of Trotsky's new theory of, quote, proletarian economy, end quote, until all that was left was a wizened, quote, critic, end quote, of Stalinism. What had begun as the idea that the Bolshevik old guard could protect temporarily the gains of the revolution developed into the view that, quote, the post-Civil War bureaucracy and then the totalitarian aristocracy acted as locums for the working class and represented the working class in power as long as they still defended nationalized economy, end quote. Albert Camus once remarked that, quote, the greatest event of the 20th century was the forsaking of the values of freedom by the revolutionary movements, end quote, and concluded that, quote, since the moment a certain hope had disappeared from the world and a solitude has begun for each and every man, end quote. Yeah, that's fucking slaps, yo. I want to repeat that for myself. Albert Camus once remarked that, quote, the great event of the 20th century was the forsaking of the values of freedom by the revolutionary movements, end quote, and concluded that, quote, since that moment a certain hope has disappeared from the world and a solitude has begun for each and every man. 1 second. You guys know that song Tattoo by The Who? I was listening to it yesterday and I was like, yeah, this is a slapping jam. Dude, I like The Who, but early Who, that shit really slaps. Anyway, sorry, I had to copy that down to my computer. Albert Camus once remarked that, quote, the great event of the 20th century was the forsaking of the values of freedom by the revolutionary movements, end quote, and concluded that, quote, since that moment a certain hope has disappeared from the world and a solitude has begun for each and every man, end quote. Orthodox Trotskyism was implicated in this forsaking, argues Matgamna, because, quote, the doctrine of the, quote, locum, end quote, implied that the workers could rule as abstract historical subjects in, quote, high theory, end quote, even where as living people in practice they were beasts of burden exploited by a privileged autocracy, end quote. The importance of the minority who opposed Trotsky in the late 1930s, often in the name of Trotsky's own earlier ideas, is that they defined socialism as not as collectivized property, but as the self-emancipation of the working class, and therefore necessarily in terms of the values of freedom and of democracy. Footnote. Matgamna traces the bifurcation of Trotsky's thought in the 1930s. In his concrete assessments, which tracked the degeneration of Russia, Trotsky registered the self-making of the bureaucracy as a new exploitative ruling class. But he left these observations at odds with his theory rather than allowing them to be the basis of a necessary theoretical development, not least because he expected the Stalinist bureaucracy to last only a matter of months, even weeks. At the end of his life, the tension internal to his thought between his concrete description of a totalitarian prison house for the working class, a regime which differed from fascism, quote, only in its more unbridled savagery, end quote, and his theory of a, quote, progressive workers' state, end quote, grew into a racking contradiction, a mix of wholly contradictory and incompatible frameworks. All this is important, if hardly original. Cliff made much the same point about, quote, two different and quite contradictory, end quote, Trotskys, and cited some of the same sources, such as Trotsky's 28 letter to Borodai in his 1948 State Capitalism in Russia half a century ago. Moreover, Matgamna stretches far too far the idea that Trotsky himself was the, quote, innovator, end quote, of the theory of bureaucratic collectivism, claiming that, quote, Shachtman will, adopt the position Trotsky, wearing the mask of Bruno Rizzi, puts forward, end quote. This is unsustainable. Hal and Ann Draper visited Rizzi in 1958 and established that before Rizzi's book was impounded, he managed to get copies to various VIPs such as Mussolini and Trotsky. With Trotsky, said Draper, he, quote, hit pay dirt, end quote. The fight over Finland was ongoing inside the Socialist Workers' Party USA, and Trotsky used Rizzi as ammunition to attack the minority. As Draper puts it, quote, Rizzi entered history when Trotsky whirled him around his head like a dead cat and let fly at the opposition, end quote. Quote, if not me, then Bruno R., end quote, was Trotsky's message. Rizzi's function was, quote, to scare the theoretical daylights out of the opposition, end quote, by a few, quote, tendentious sentences and vague claims, end quote, claimed Draper. Trotsky did not, quote, put forward, end quote, Rizzi's theory, and Rizzi's book was never available to the minority. The belief that the minority copied the theory from Rizzi, directly or via Trotsky, is nonsense, as Haberkern and Lipow make clear in an appendix on The Myth of Bruno Rizzi. The idea was in the air. End footnote. The minority defined Marxism not as an economic necessitarianism, but, in Shachtman's happy phrase, as the, quote, self-critical science of working class revolution, end quote. The third camp reclaimed as Marxist the idea that democracy and individual freedom are the sine qua non of socialism from below, and none more so than Hal Draper, whose writings theorized socialism not as a dogma or social blueprint, but as a, quote, line of struggle, end quote, the open-ended journey of self-emancipation of the popular majority. For Draper, even Marx's Capital is ultimately, quote, nothing but the demonstration of the economic basis, end quote, of the possibility of emancipation, of self-emancipation, excuse me. The glittering prize held out by the third camp is a Marxism in which democracy and liberty have a theoretical status and practical role as pivotal to socialism as the self-activity of the working class and its collective control over production. Hal Draper, quote, the working class, which owns no property, can, quote, own, end quote, and control the means of production only through a political intermediary of the state, and it can, quote, own, and quote, and it can, quote, own and control the state only through democratic participation. Without democracy, stratification points not to socialism, but to what we know as Stalinism. Democracy, therefore, is not merely of sentimental or moral value for the Marxists, nor is democracy merely a preference. Democracy designates the only way in which the rule of the working class can exist in political actuality, end quote. Hal Draper. Quote, the rights and privileges of the individual must not be subordinated to the glorification of state as communal collectivity, or to the maximization of the state's power, but exactly to the contrary. The authority and rights of the organized collectivity or state are justified only insofar as they contribute to the full development of every individual's potentiality as a human being. The beehive or anthill conception of collectivism is not socialism, but the image of a new tyranny. End quote. Hal Draper. Capitalism, Stalinism, and the struggle for the world. Russia, then, was not the first rung on the ladder of socialism, but the, quote, the image of a new tyranny, end quote. Neither a worker state transitional to socialism nor a capitalist state, but a new and unique form of exploitative class society, which was termed, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote. Hal Draper defined the bureaucratic collectivist social system as, quote, a new social order which is neither capitalist nor socialist, but which is based on the control of both economy and government by an elite bureaucracy, forming a new exploitative ruling class which runs the fused political economic structure not for private profit gains of any individuals or groups, but for its own collective aggrandizement in power, prestige, and revenue by administrative planning from above, end quote. Hal Draper. The bureaucracy was the ruling class, and the bureaucracy derived its power from its de facto control of the state, which owned the means of production de jure. In a statified economy, the monopoly of political power was a monopoly of economic power. From this brute fact grew the specific mode of surplus extraction and the specific contradictions, forms of class struggle, and forms of crisis of bureaucratic collectivist society. Production, said Shachtman, quote, is carried on and extended for the satisfaction of the needs of the bureaucracy, for the increasing of the bureaucracy's wealth, its privileges, its power, end quote. The surplus is pumped out of the direct producers, the working class, by the bureaucracy, which had a tendency to, quote, increase and expand, end quote, this exploitation. The basic contradiction peculiar to bureaucratic collectivist society was that between the necessity of planning, the only other possible economic regulator, the capitalist market, having been abolished, and the impossibility of planning, the only possible basis of planning, democracy, having been abolished. This was the, quote, law of motion, end quote, the, quote, dynamic of the bureaucratic collectivist society, the repeated and doomed efforts of the ruling class to resolve the contradiction between planning and totalitarianism. The attempt to regulate a modern industrial economy by UKASA, or UKAS, UKASE, which I've learned means decree. It's particularly the decrees of like the czar, so it's kind of sort of like a metaphor, but it's like a basically means decree. Produced only the, quote, galloping disease, end quote, of chaos, of the, quote, fantastic botches, gnarls, snags, waste, and snafus, end quote, as Draper put it. Only able to fight the disease of bureaucratism with more bureaucratic controls, production was kept up for a time by a combination of, quote, fantastic expenditures of human labor, enslaved or virtually enslaved, end quote. The enslaved part's not a metaphor. That's the forced labor was very widespread in the Soviet Union. Even if it didn't make up the majority of labor, it made up a lot of labor. And the looting and robbing of dependent satellites. Far from being a progressive, quote, stage, the, quote, dynamism of the decades from the 1920s to the 1960s was the reflection of a brutalist labor regime imposed by the bureaucracy in a doomed attempt to escape the basic contradiction of totalitarianism while competing militarily and politically with the West. Footnote. The state capitalist tradition interprets this military competition as having comparable effects to classical capitalist market competition, imposing a capitalist logic on, quote, Russia Inc., end quote. The relationship between the two components of the third camp tradition, the British International Socialist / Workers' Party tradition, and the American third camp groups, which developed close relations in the 1950s and the late 1960s, is not the subject of this review. I think the fundamental political divide in anti-Stalinist Marxism lies between the workers' state theories and their, quote, proletarian Bonapartism, end quote, on the one side, and the state capitalist / bureaucratic collectivist theories with their insistence on workers' democracy on the other. Yeah, that's like I said, like like I said about Alliance for Workers' Liberty, which I think Alan Johnson used to be part of, but I think he's moved into a different type of, he's still, I think he would still call himself a democratic socialist. In fact, he does. But I don't really, I'm not really actually sure of like the actual like political intentions or goals of the Alliance for Workers' Liberty. I mean, they like work within like the Labor Party and stuff like that. But I'm only really familiar with them for their commentaries on Israel Palestine and the things that they have to say about third campism generally and bureaucratic collectivism. But within that, within that party, though, like I said, I don't know if I said it in this reading or another reading, but Thomas Martin, I believe, embraces a form of state capitalism theory within within the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, which generally takes on, at least historically, has taken on a bureaucratic collectivist theory of the Soviet Union. So the fact that there's so I think that Alan Johnson is very right to say that that main divide is not between it's not like a 3-part divide where they're all equally hostile to each other. There's definitely more solidarity between the state capitalist and bureaucratic collectivist theories than there are otherwise. Than between there's more similarities between them, either of them having similarities with the degenerated worker state thesis. That seems like the main thing that they're opposing. And I think it's significant on a couple things that are significant is one, Cornelius Castoriadis rejected the state capitalist theory while rejecting the degenerated worker state theory in the early part of his break with Trotskyism, but then moved to a more, what you would probably consider a state capitalist theory. Although, and then, so without really feeling much of a need at all to like comment on that at all, he, like, Castoriadis didn't really feel like, oh, like, like I've moved from this kind of like conception of like Soviet society as a new exploiting form of domination that doesn't take on capitalist or socialist characteristics. And he just kind of seamlessly transitions into a state capitalist theory. The other thing that I think is significant is that, when Raya Dunayevskaya and CLR James split from the Socialist Workers' Party USA, and as when they were the Johnson Forrest tendency, and then went on to produce News and Letters, because they left the Socialist Workers' Party, it's easy to forget that at one time they were in the Workers' Party, whose entire reason for people joining the Workers' Party, more or less, was the rejection of the degenerated workers' state thesis. So there's seems like there's a pretty considerable overlap between, at least political overlap between people, and I think that makes sense. I think there's a politics that falls out whether you claim the Soviet Union is a degenerated worker state or not. I think there's a very much a political understanding of what socialism entails. There's an understanding of how it's achieved, what are its core constitutive features, and what are like the kind of like political values guiding it. So it makes sense that most people who favor some kind of, whether it be Hal Draper or Raya Dunayevskaya, or people who kind of get to the state capitalist thesis early, like Council Communist, all those people are, what they're trying to give an account for in their different ways is the non-emancipatory character of this mode of production, like at its grassroots, not in the degree to which a certain segment of the bureaucracy has usurped political power, and that the bureaucracy siphons off surpluses for itself. These are like deep critiques of like the Soviet structure as opposed to the degenerated workers' state, which is more superficial, and why, for example, the solution in the Trotskyist camp was a so-called political, not a social revolution in Russia to overthrow Stalinism. But anyway, back to this footnote. Hal Draper reviewed Tony Cliff's book State Capitalism in Russia and found an analysis which, quote, winds up ... virtually identical to our own, end quote, in which the, quote, political conclusions are very close to, if not identical with, those of independent socialism, end quote, and which Draper was happy to recommend as a book which, quote, belongs in every socialist library, end quote. It's actually very interesting. I think I'm going to draw on this article a lot, dude. This is good stuff here. End footnote. Draper argued that the bureaucratic collectivist society was, quote, immune to the specific capitalist form of crisis as were the pre-capitalist systems, a crisis associated with, quote, overproduction, end quote, a crisis of glut in the midst of poverty and want, unemployment because of an overabundance of goods, such as the U.S. saw in the 1930s, is unthinkable for it. In replacing capitalism, it has truly abolished the capitalist source of crisis only in order to develop its own specific forms of crisis, end quote. Although the failure to specify the laws of motion of bureaucratic collectivist society has been a standard criticism of the theory, I am not sure it is entirely fair. If Russia was indeed, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote, then for that very reason it would not possess, quote, laws of motion, end quote, analogous to those established by Marx for capitalist society. Such seemingly non-political, quote, laws of motion, end quote, depend on a disjunction between economic base and political superstructure, a feature of neither bureaucratic collectivist societies sorry, computer stuff. Excuse me. Such seemingly non-political, quote, laws of motion, end quote, depend upon a disjunction between economic base and political superstructure, a feature of neither bureaucratic collectivist societies nor pre-capitalist societies. In societies in which politics and economics are fused, then, as Lukács observed, quote, the state is not a mediation of the economic control of society, it is that unmediated dominance itself, end quote. Moreover, quote, legal institutions intervene substantively in the interplay of economic forces, end quote, until there, quote, are no purely economic categories, economic and legal categories are objectively so interwoven as to be inseparable, end quote. The wide-ranging consequences of this fusion of politics and economics were pointed out by Perry Anderson in his account of pre-capitalist modes of production. Quote, the, quote, superstructures, end quote, necessarily enter into the constitutive structures of the mode of production in pre-capitalist social formations. The superstructures intervene directly in the, quote, internal, end quote, nexus of surplus extraction, In consequence, pre-capitalist modes of production cannot be defined except via their political, legal, and ideological superstructures, since these are what determine the type of extra economic coercion that specifies them. The precise forms of juridical dependence, property, and sovereignty that characterize a pre-capitalist social formation, far from being merely accessory or contingent epiphenomenon, compose, on the contrary, the central indices of the determinate mode of production within it, end quote. Employing an essentially similar understanding in their theory of bureaucratic collectivist society, and mapping its unique contradictions and forms of class struggle in light of it, the third camp developed a series of prescient and penetrating analyses of Stalinism in the post-war world. Reading these analyses half a century later, it is clear that whatever weaknesses, gaps, errors, and overstatements we might identify, the third camp Marxists were able to avoid the kind of debilitating illusions which define so much of the left, whether they were assessing the prospects for revolution and reform in Stalinist societies, assigning meaning to the post-war expansion of Stalinism, or responding politically to the development of, quote, national Stalinisms, end quote, such as Tito's. Class struggle and revolution. To take the prospects for the class struggle as a case in point, one finds in the text an alternative to both Arendtian despair of the totalitarian monolith and Deutscherite illusion in the self-reforming capacity of the bureaucracy. Yeah, this was yeah, it seems like there's just kind of like this thing that I hadn't really thought about when I was looking at I think his name's Christoph Juncker, his work on Leo Kofler, who has a little subchapter in Marcel van der Linden's Western Marxism in the Soviet Union. And I was looking into Junke's book about Leo Kofler, and that's kind of seems like one of the strands that was in addition to say a social democratic critique of the Soviet Union, or a left communist or Trotskyist or third campus kind of conception of the Soviet Union. There was another one that Leo Kofler, who was a West German philosopher, subscribed to, which would be some kind of reform communism, which I think would also be represented by people like Georg Lukács. And it sounds like what Johnson's saying here is that Deutscher would also probably fall into this this group, even though despite being a Trotskyist and maybe probably has, and it seems like there's probably some overlap between reform communism and degenerated worker state thesis. Anyway, to take the prospects for the class struggle as a case in point, one finds in these texts an alternative to both Arendtian despair of the totalitarian monolith and Deutscherite illusion in the self-reforming capacity of the bureaucracy. This latter illusion often leads its believers to side with that bureaucracy against popular revolts from below. As with Deutscher's opposition to the East Berlin workers in 1953 as an unruly obstacle to controlled liberalization from above. Jacobson. Yeah, I actually have that essay that talks about that. Essay about that. It's by Julius Jacobson, who was one of the initiators, maybe the initiator. I'm not sure. I think Hal Draper might have been with him, and so was Julius Jacobson's wife, whose name I can't remember. They started the journal New Politics, which has a lot of good stuff in it, or often has good stuff in it. But yeah, they have a paper by him called I actually have two papers by him. The first one's about it's called Isaac Deutscher, Anatomy of an Apologist, and The Two Deaths of Max Shachtman, which is a critique of Max Shachtman's rightward turn in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Anyway, hopes for reform burnt bright until the bitter end among many Orthodox Trotskyists influenced by Deutscher. I think it says a lot that about the British left, that one of the main, I guess it's not specifically for British people, but the Isaac Deutscher, one of the main prizes for theoretical accomplishments is the Isaac and Tamara Deutscher award for it goes for books written each year within the Marxist tradition. It kind of gives you an idea of the politics that kind of go along with that. Especially one of the main things I think of is the very conservative book by what his name, G.A. Cohen, called Marxist Theory of History and Defense, which kind of just has a really mechanical base superstructure conception of social ontology that most people would a lot of the best minds within the contemporary Marxist theory have panned ruthlessly. Anyway, footnote: these hopes of reform marked post-war Orthodox Trotskyists as a species of Deutscherism, hankering after Trotsky's pre-1933 reform perspective. Tariq Ali, at one time a leading figure in the Fourth International, was not only formed politically by, quote, Isaac Deutscher, Leon Trotsky, and Ernest Mandel, in that order, end quote, but dedicated revolution from above, Ali 1988 to Boris Yeltsin, and claimed to hear in Gorbachev, quote, the authentic voice of the cantankerous man in the British Museum, echoing in the chambers of the Kremlin, end quote. There sure were some strange voices to be heard in Deutscher's watchtower. The third camp, by contrast, pointed out that, as the economic power of the ruling class resided in its political monopoly, then, quote, even such measures of popular political control are possible under capitalism, end quote, were impossible. Political reform would and did disintegrate the economic power of the ruling class. Capitalism as a mode of production, because of the disjunction between economic base and political superstructure, could coexist happily with a variety of state forms. The fusion of politics and economics in bureaucratic collectivist society ensured that, quote, the introduction of political democracy of any meaningful sort automatically means the dissolution of economic exploitation, end quote. And consequently, the state form, said Draper, quote, is necessarily not only that of a dictatorship but also totalitarian, i.e. intolerant of any and all independent centers of power in the country, and not only oppressive but terroristic, end quote. The juridic illusion of the orthodox Trotskyists defined anti-capitalism as progressive in and of itself, and as congealed in nationalized property, understood as, quote, proletarian economy, end quote, to which the bureaucracy were imagined to be in sharp contradiction. This notion was fantastically retained by the Orthodox even after the creation by Stalinist forces over a large part of the globe of replica, quote, proletarian democracies, end quote. The price was a wholly new and positive assessment of Stalinism as a, quote, fundamentally proletarian, end quote, force capable of creating worker states which socialists were obliged to defend unconditionally against capitalism. In contrast, Hal Draper wrote, quote, the police state is the superstructure that is not only appropriate to, but required by an economy based on nationalist property owned by a bureaucratic class, end quote. Hal Draper. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, and I think there's some of that in Trotsky as well. I mean, obviously he doesn't know what we know now, but like, it seems I'm reading one thing is like it's like I can't remember exactly what it's called, but I'm reading from Trotsky's collected works, and like the leaps of praise that he puts onto puts it like a very strong deal of praise on the achievements of Stalinism, insofar as it remained on its so-called left-wing side of its zigzagging between right and left as part of the mediocre center. It seems like Stalin won, but who Trotsky even more opposed than Stalin was Bukharin, who believed in extending the new economic policy as the only sustainable thing for the Soviet society to do. Granted, it was largely agrarian and isolated geographically and geopolitically, I guess. But yeah, the celebration of I think that's one of the main. I say this all the time, but I think that's like one of the main values of the bureaucratic collectivist thesis is that Stalinism, especially in the 1930s, had very anti-capitalistic qualities that were not emancipatory. I think that kind of just like something being anti-capitalist, being progressive in and of itself needs to be rejected. like I was at the bookstore. There's a radical bookstore in the area that I live, and I was looking at this book from Verso, and it was a book about Hezbollah, and it was more or less saying it was like a critique of Hezbollah, but one of the main things it was saying was that it's fundamentally neoliberal, and it's not that it like in terms of its like economic policy, and it's not like that's you know if it was like it's not like that's like a inconsequential, but to me, and I would say this is not just like a personal opinion. I think whether Hezbollah had a real thorough plan of nationalization of private means of production would make them more emancipatory than if they were neoliberal. If the like, and I think that's same true. Kind of thinking with like people, this is kind of like a crass example. It's kind of like a stupid argument that's kind of like hard to debate, or hard to talk about, or people don't want to talk about it. It's like if the Nazis were actually socialists, say that National Socialism, at as described by the Nazis, actually had some kind of property, some serious kind of redistributive thrust against private property, that would not make it. That would not make Nazism good. Like, what makes Nazism bad isn't whether it's capitalist or socialist or not. Obviously, the socialist content of Nazism was all like window dressing and bullshit, even from like a highly statist perspective. But it's like, it's important to remember that, for me at least, you don't have to agree with me. No one has to agree with me. But something being anti-capitalist and being exploitative are not mutually exclusive. You have a totally in-kind, non-market economy with no private property, and it be exploitative. Anyway, armed with this understanding, Draper was able to predict as early as 1948 that, quote, the dictatorship of the bureaucracy will not, quote, soften, end quote, with years. It can only grow brittle before it is shattered by the irrepressible revolt of the people, end quote. Draper also showed how the specific contradictions of bureaucratic collectivist society were themselves the source of the continual reproduction of illusory hopes in the, quote, reforming bureaucracy, end quote. The bureaucracy was repeatedly forced to try and resolve the economic contradictions of totalitarianism through a, quote, cycle of repression and relaxation, end quote. It first, quote, tries to escape the discipline of centralized authority, end quote, by liberalization, producing the wave of illusions in its self-reforming capacity, but also the very popular energies which erode its own political and hence economic monopoly. The cycle was completed with the bureaucracy, quote, finding its needs and whip for its own good. The cycle was completed with the bureaucracy, quote, finding that it needs the whip for its own good, end quote. I had to rephrase that, so it could be confusing. End quote. Draper mocked the idea that, quote, only NATO militarism can free the atomized mass of slaves, end quote. In fact, quote, no social class or stratum has shown such persistent, bitter, and rigorous resistance to the bureaucracy's police state as has the industrial working class, end quote. The anti-Stalinist revolutions of 1956, Draper hailed as breaking the, quote, the myth that Stalinism had produced the dehumanized Orwellian, quote, prole, end quote, as its mass man, or the totalitarianized zombie heralded by Hannah Arendt, end quote. The quote, evil empire, end quote. The expansion of Stalinism after World War II is another area in which the third camp refused the illusions of the orthodox. Matgamna traces in some detail how the orthodox Trotskyists defined that expansion as a distorted expression of the unfolding world revolution led for now by Stalinists. The third camp observed this was to make the, quote, appointment of slave drivers over industry by the GPU equal the proletarian revolution, end quote. Following Shachtman, Matgamna argues this developed into a, quote, totalitarian economism, end quote. The Workers' Party Independent Socialist League, by contrast, mapped the rise of a, quote, Stalinist imperialism, end quote, and the creation of a Stalinist and most definitely evil empire rooted in the specific, quote, economic compulsions and internal contradictions, end quote, of bureaucratic collectivist society. Hal Draper pointed out that each class society possessed a specific drive to imperialism determined by the nature of its internal contradictions. Only those who saw the Stalinist society as internally without inherent contradictions were able to see its expansionism as a, quote, regrettable excrescence, end quote, or merely, quote, defensive, end quote. Draper identified three drives to Stalinist imperialism, all stemming from the specific social relations and contradictions of bureaucratic collectivism as a social system. First, the basic contradiction between planning and totalitarianism, which led to anarchy and waste in production, produced a search for compensation. Internally, this involved the use of slave labor and, quote, mercilessly driven factories, end quote. Externally, the search led to, quote, exploitation of peoples abroad, end quote, and the, quote, looting of conquered territories, end quote. Precisely because Russia was not capitalist and because the problem faced by the Stalinist bureaucracy was how to get production up, not how to avoid crises of overproduction. It had available, quote, a method of foreign exploitation which is excluded for capitalist imperialism, direct looting of goods and products, end quote. To my understanding, like, for example, like in East Germany, I think they, like, straight up were, like, and I think in other places as well, but I know in East Germany, I think the Soviet Union just straight up, like, stripped factories completely of all equipment and transferred it directly to Russia. I'm pretty sure that was the case. Maybe I'm making that up, but I don't think I am. Second, the fact that the bureaucracy was a collective owner of property meant reward in the Stalinist system necessarily took the form of bureaucratic privilege. Stalinist imperialism, quote, creates a wider base for bureaucratic posts, end quote. Third, Stalinism could not coexist with free labor. In terms that read like a description of the collapse of Stalinism in 1989, Draper wrote in 1967 of the bureaucracy's, quote, inherent inability to indefinitely continue to live in coexistence with a system where, in any way at all, a free labor movement exists just across the border. This is a permanent political danger to them. It cannot go on forever. As long as free labor exists in the world, there is a dynamite fuse extending from the outside to inside the Iron Curtain, end quote. The triangle of forces in the third camp. From 1946, the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League sought to come to grips with the wider theoretical and political consequences of the expansion of Stalinism and developed the theory of a new stage in the epoch of wars and revolutions, summed up in the phrase, quote, the triangle of forces, end quote. The bureaucratic collectivist ruling class was understood as a, quote, bidder for the historical role of successor to a doomed capitalism, end quote. This demanded a transformation of Marxism itself, quote, in at least as sweeping a fashion as the adaptation accomplished by Leninism in its time on the basis of a recognition of the new stage of imperialism, end quote. Marxists could no longer afford to think that, quote, every blow struck against capitalism is a blow for the socialist future, end quote. Now the working class faced two enemies, quote, a capitalism which is anti-Stalinist and a Stalinism which is anti-capitalist, end quote. In other words, quote, what has emerged into the light is a three-cornered struggle for power. It is this new constellation of social forces which disorients and confuses the working class movement. It is recognized of this new stage which is the basis of the politics of the third camp. The alternative to it is the support of capitalism via the reformists, or left-handed support of Stalinism via the Fourth International majority. From that dichotomy, there is no escape to freedom. End quote. Haberkern and Lipow. Or Lipow. I don't fucking know. The failure to understand that Stalinism did not represent progress, but a new totalitarian exploitative social system, a contender with both capitalism and socialism, was, quote, the source of the new and unprecedented ideological crisis of socialism today, ... In the first place, a crisis in the very meaning of socialism, end quote. The importance of the third camp was its development of, quote, a socialist analysis which planted a firm fixed point at the third vertex of the triangle, so to speak, from which to carry on uncompromisingly the working class struggle against both of the rival exploitative systems contending for domination. This is the viewpoint of the Independent Socialist League, worked out in the course of its 18.5 years of existence, a revolutionary democratic socialism for our time. Draper. Contrast this with Ernest Mandel's disastrous conclusion that, quote, the Chinese Communist Party ... was striving to destroy capitalism and therefore represented a fundamentally proletarian social force, end quote. That little word, quote, therefore, end quote, is the site of a paradigm shift within Marxism. Before Stalinism, Marxists had imagined the world as a zero-sum game, capitalism versus socialism. Actually, it never was, but until an equally exploitive reactionary alternative proved to be capable of issuing from anti-capitalism, it was not in practice too harmful. After Stalinism, it was a catastrophic framework, theoretically and practically, not least in the implications for the place of democracy and liberty in Marxism, now ungroundable at best and subordinated to nationalized property at worst. However, once Stalinism is located within the triangular struggle as a social system which is anti-capitalist and anti-working class, then the place of democracy in the socialist project is transformed. Draper again, quote, in no other area than this does the fight for democracy rise to such a pinnacle of importance for the forces of progress. No other movement in the history of the world is so driven to place the democratic goal so close to everything it strives for, end quote. I'm sorry. Alarm. End quote. Draper. The third camp analysis was applied with astonishing success to the development of conflicts within the Stalinist camp. The Workers' Party Independent Socialist League was able to grasp immediately that the rupture between Stalin and Tito was a split between two Stalinist powers, and to locate the economic drives behind Titoism. The Fourth International, in contrast, tucking in and buttoning up its theoretical shirt of Nessus, indulged in what Natalia Trotsky called the, quote, inexcusable idealization, end quote, of the Titoist bureaucracy as a revolutionary workers' party building a workers' state, a retreat beyond even the 1929 to 1933 left opposition reform perspective. The third camp analyzed the Tito split as a case of, quote, national Stalinism, end quote, a conflict of interest between an imperialist bureaucratic collectivist class, Russia, and a native bureaucratic collectivist class in formation, Yugoslavia, bidding for junior partner rather than branch manager status. It is difficult to read these contrasting analyses decades later and avoid the conclusion that one is comparing serious Marxist analysis with delusion. The third camp grasped that the conflict was not about the nature of the social system, but about, quote, who is to benefit from the exploitation of the masses, end quote. While Russia sought to make Yugoslavia an economic appendage to the needs of the Russian economy, the Tito machine was making itself into a ruling class through a policy of industrialization. The, quote, sine qua non for the transformation of the bureaucracy into an indigenous ruling class, end quote. Haberkern and Lipow. Such splits were an inevitable process given the basic character and contradictions of bureaucratic collectivist society. No more anomalous than conflicts between capitalist states. There was a disintegrative tendency within the Stalinist empire produced by the basic contradictions of bureaucratic collectivist social relations within Russia. The contradiction between the planning and totalitarianism, which blocked the development of the productive forces inside Russia, led to the expansionist drive to find a way out of imperialism. The contradiction between planning and totalitarianism, which blocked the development of the productive forces inside Russia, led to the expansionist drive to find a way out by way of imperialism. But unlike U.S. imperialism, Russia could not keep control of its empire economically. That was simply, quote, not in the nature of a system which operates through bureaucratic planning from above by the terroristic political apparatus, end quote. Hal Draper. Control could only be political. Hence, quote, the terrorism of the Stalinist system is not a defense mechanism against capitalist encirclement, but an inherent part of bureaucratic collectivism, ... The imminent driving force of bureaucratic collectivist totalitarianism show up more starkly in its empire than in Moscow or even Irkutsk. Bureaucratic collectivism and historical materialism. What was the place of bureaucratic collectivist societies in history? In 1948, Tony Cliff argued that Shachtman was chronically unclear about the place of bureaucratic collectivist societies in, quote, the chain of historical development, end quote, about whether such societies were progressive or not in relation to capitalism, and about whether they represented a new and a necessary stage in world history or a mere aberration made in Russia. I'm not exactly sure about this, but I was just reading about the International Socialists, which was the group around Tony Cliff, which became the Socialist Workers' Party. And it seemed like, as opposed to like other state capitalists and bureaucratic collectivists, Tony Cliff's tendency still had the view in some capacity. It seems like they at least had the same view. Whereas like the Shachtman group, the bureaucratic collectivists and the state capitalists um, were very extremely pessimistic, if out like had like rejected the possibility of contemporary developments within the USSR, even if they weren't socialists themselves, being a stepping stone to socialism, a transitional society of some kind, which is often used, expressed by orthodox Trotskyists. The notion of not the transitional period, but the transitional society between capitalism and socialism. It seems like Tony Cliff, in my mind, from what I was gathering from that, and maybe this isn't true, so don't like quote me on it, but it seemed like what Tony Cliff was kind of had the idea that like because state capitalism was so like I guess like centralized and monopolized, that it was itself a kind of was ripe, very much ripe for a socialist development. I don't know how he conceptualized revolution, or like how like Stalinism would or could be reformed or overthrown, and state capitalism be reformed or be overthrown. I guess he'd want it to be overthrown, but it seems like he kind of viewed it as in some case progressive, whereas the Shachtmanites didn't. Again, I'm not exactly sure about that, so don't quote me on it, but that was kind of the impression I was getting. How did the worker... So back to the text. How did the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League respond to such criticisms? First, by rejecting the very idea that there is a chain of historical development. Hal Draper argued that in the 20th century, history had arrived at, quote, a historic fork in social development, end quote. The proletarian revolution is the first revolution in human history which must be both majoritarian and self-conscious. Capitalism must be disintegrating and, quote, can no longer go on in the old way, end quote. But the capitalism may be disintegrating and, quote, can no longer go on in the same way, or the old way, end quote. But the historic fork arises because, quote, the working class has not yet succeeded in burying it, end quote. Bureaucratic collectivism emerges at the historical conjuncture when the capitalist mode of production is degenerating. There is a systematic need for collectivization, yet the working class fails to bring about socialism. A fork in the road where bureaucratic collectivism and democratic collectivism fought it out. If not democratic collectivism, then bureaucratic collectivism would sum up the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League's view. Trotsky refused to confront seriously the possibility that an exploiting class society could follow capitalism. This was in part a refusal of the political conclusion that socialism was off the agenda for an epoch. But Trotsky here assumed a unidirectionality to history and an objectivity inappropriate to the specific character of the proletarian revolution and socialism. Objectively, capitalism can be replaced now by a democratic collectivism. But the democratic collectivism, unlike capitalism, cannot emerge, quote, behind the backs, end quote, of the people as a, quote, necessary, end quote, stage, or as the working out of some law or the unfolding of some process through the cunning of history. Socialism is the conscious creation of a self-conscious collective actor. Some good shit right there. Socialism is the conscious creation of a self-conscious collective actor. The consequence is simple yet profound. The subjective factor, the unity and consciousness of the working class, its ability to lead an alliance of progressive social forces, the size, maturity, and authority of the vanguard, rises to world historic significance. The subjective is the switchman of history which travels down one of two possible branch lines: democratic or bureaucratic collectivism. The prolonged failure of the subjective factor in the 20th century accounts for what are, on the surface, absurd notions such as the belief that we have lived through an era of abhorrent relapse and that Stalinism was a global tendency which is neither objectively necessary nor progressive. But if the notion of a historical fork leaves democratic collectivism as, quote, only, end quote, a possibility, then equally it leaves bureaucratic collectivism as a social system without a historical tenure in the sense Trotsky feared and James Burnham in the Managerial Revolution, written after he left the Workers' Party, granted. Draper wrote in 1967, quote, to denominate Stalinism as a social system does not confer on Stalinism any determinate lease of life, nor any historical era of existence. History does not give social systems any uniform term, ... Unlike any previous system, bureaucratic collectivism had hardly appeared on the scene before it was shaken by economic and political convulsions. The revolution against Stalinism did not have to remain a vision for a couple hundred years, as was true of the revolution against capitalism. The revolution against Stalinism appeared in a life a little more than a couple of decades, in Budapest, in East Germany, in Poland at least, end quote. I suppose it wouldn't, Hal Draper, I suppose wouldn't fit into the third camp Trotskyism's conception of history, but I think it would certainly make sense to include Kronstadt in that, even though it was pre-Stalin period. But the handling of Kronstadt and the politics coming out of Kronstadt definitely were comparable to the politics coming out of Hungary in 1956. Hal Draper sought to ground the theory of bureaucratic collectivism in the categories of historical materialism by a scrupulous excavation of Marx and Engels' writings in Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, Volume 1. On the side note here, it's meaningful to say here that Paul Maddock Jr., I remember reading in one of his articles, he references this book and esteems it highly. Obviously, he's not a Trotskyist or a Leninist, but a council communist, but I think it says something about the power of Draper's work if someone outside of his immediate political milieu has something nice to say about it. And like I said, the other main American people coming out of like a left communist tradition would be Lauren Goldner, and in Lauren Goldner's one essay on May 68 or like 1968 in Berkeley. He says that that's what he comes out of his initial introduction to socialism was via the independent socialist clubs. I think there were clubs by that point. That might have been a later development, but the the independent socialist tendency within the United States. In Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, Volume 1, bureaucratic collectivism is recast as a full-blown development of a phenomenon known and theorized by Marx and Engels, the, quote, autonomized state, end quote. Stalinist Russia exhibited, quote, the complete freeing of the state power's autonomization from all control by any previous existent social class, and the transformation of the state bureaucracy into a new ruling class exploiting the mass of the people, end quote. But the concept of a completely, quote, autonomized state, end quote, is no Weberian sociology. The, quote, state, end quote, is not seen as growing independent of, quote, society, end quote. The claim is rather that the state, in particular periods of the life course of modes of production, i.e., their decline and disintegration, grows independent of any of the classes of society. State autonomization develops to a greater or lesser extent depending upon the state of dissolution of society caused by an equilibrium between the classes. Usually as a ruling class is on the wane and the up-and-coming class is not able to rule. At that moment, a moment that can last for centuries, the state develops autonomously for the classes. The state is not their instrument even while remaining dependent on society and social development as such. It is a kind of historical backstop which, when the progressive class swings and misses, or does not, for conjunctural reasons, swing at all, develops as a, quote, residual legatee, end quote, of society. Draper traced a series of writings in which Marx and Engels confronted states in various degrees of autonomization from A, the period of the dissolution of the Roman Empire leading to, quote, the rule of the Praetorians, end quote, to B, the period of the dissolution of feudalism producing the absolute monarchies of the 17th and 18th centuries, C, the various Bonapartisms of Europe in the 19th century in the context of equilibrium between bourgeois and proletariat. But the politico-intellectual context, indeed the entire purpose and meaning of Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, the book, is missed unless one grasps that for 40 years Draper, as a militant of the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League, had argued that D, the period of the decay and dissolution of capitalism combined with the failure of the working class to take power and reorganize society, had led to full-blown bureaucratic collectivism in the East and the bureaucratic collectivization of capitalism in the West. For Draper, these were all examples of, quote, a special type of state arising out of the, quote, common ruin of the contending classes, end quote. For when a whole civil society disintegrates, the only institution remaining to keep society together is the state. Not to keep the old society together anymore, but to keep a society, some kind of organized society, together on any terms. The autonomized state becomes the residual legatee of society for a historical period. The political institutionalization of force, the state, infuses all the processes of society and subordinates everything to itself. The political and economic institutions fuse. The state is no longer simply a superstructure. The state has swallowed up all of society. End quote. Draper. Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, the book, tells us not just that Marx was the theorist of socialism from below, the, quote, democratic extremist, end quote, but that the great theoretical disaster of 20th century revolutionary socialism has been its failure to separate itself theoretically or practically from socialism from above. This systematic use of an analogy between the bourgeois revolution / Bonapartism and the proletarian revolution / Stalinism left its adherents against their own better desires in the orbit of totalitarianism. This analogy was not just without warrant as a Marxist idea, but politically it ate away at the democratic, quote, from below, end quote, of soul of socialism. If you haven't read it or listened to it, it's on YouTube in like an audiobook format, not from me, but from, it might be just a robot reading it, I don't know. But The Two Souls of Socialism by Hal Draper is a phenomenal essay, which if I was to recommend someone say, hey, I'm curious about socialism, what should I read? I would recommend that, amongst other things. The other one would be the booklet put out, Alternative to Capitalism, by Adam Buick and John Crump. So if you have a friend who's just getting into these kinds of things, I would recommend that. And I would also recommend it to you if you haven't listened to it. What would you recommend to me? Draper contrasts Marx's, quote, drumfire of denunciation and indictment against the Bonapartist regimes, end quote, as, quote, the deadliest weapons in the hands of an irreconcilable foe, end quote, to Deutscher, sitting in his watchtower telling the insurgent workers of East Berlin to stop their revolt and submit to the progressive bureaucracy. The book Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution is not just an excavation of the political theory of Marx, but also a political intervention into a fatally confused and disoriented revolutionary socialist movement. It is the most serious attempt to establish the theory of bureaucratic collectivism as a return to and not a departure from classical Marxism. Conclusion. The third camp recast Marxism's relationship to pluralism. The self-emancipatory practice of the working class requires pluralism. The only possible polity in which the working class can exercise its role is a plural and democratic polity. Democracy is established as scientifically necessary for workers' rule, and socialism in three senses. Economic necessity. It is impossible to socialize an economy without democracy. The fundamental contradiction peculiar... Sorry, did I miss a footnote? The fundamental contradiction peculiar to Stalinist society was the absence of democracy in a statified society. Political necessity. Without democracy, the old capitalist class was removed, but a new bureaucratic ruling class was put in its place. The working class can only rule collectively through a democratic form of government. Cultural necessity. Democracy is the cultural ground tone of socialism. Socialism as a regulative idea is approached through democratic struggles. Marx himself, Draper reminds us, quote, came to an acceptance of the socialist idea through the battle for the consistent extension of democratic control from below, end quote. And Marx's socialism, quote, may be most quickly defined as the complete democratization of society, not merely of political forms, end quote. We know now this is the only way we will journey towards socialism as a free, self-controlling, and insurgent people taking back conscious democratic control of all our social powers. When the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League rejected the analogy between the bourgeois and proletarian revolutions, it broke Marxism decisively from economic necessitarianism, which in the epoch of Stalinism became what Matgamna calls, quote, totalitarian economism, end quote. George McLennan has argued that defining, quote, the intrinsic value of a form of economic organization, end quote, as something, quote, established prior to the specification of its framework of political institutions, end quote, has meant that, quote, however well-intentioned Marxists are nowadays about the need to value democracy, The latter simply cannot play a significant theoretical role in the class analysis of politics, end quote. This was exactly the road down which Trotsky's, quote, proletarian economy, end quote, led. The relationship between democracy, freedom, and human emancipation was lost. Thinking of the socialist revolution and the rule of the working class by analogy with the bourgeois revolution and the rule of the bourgeoisie was, as we have seen, a theoretical shirt of Nessus, hesitantly, provisionally placed on a young and beleaguered movement by Trotsky, and later, around 1948, enthusiastically buttoned up and tucked in by his orthodox followers. It was a theoretical and political disaster. These two important collections remind us of the lasting historical significance of the Workers' Party Independent Socialist League in finding another road, readapting in the new conditions of their own time the principles of classical Marxism, that socialism is self-emancipation, and therefore that a, quote, workers' state, end quote, without workers' democracy is worse than meaningless. For a generation of Marxists seeking to move beyond the cul-de-sac of, quote, proletarian economy, end quote, these lost texts from the third camp are an important resource, for they restore the relationship between democracy and socialism in the widest sense, freedom and socialism. Thanks for listening. Oh, there's a footnote I missed. Draper makes the case after a detailed exegesis that, quote, the revolution from above by the autonomized state power was not accepted by Marx and Engels as a progressive substitute for revolution, end quote. Shachtman's extended review of Deutscher's Stalin is perhaps his best essay. It should be seen as a classic in the canon of socialism from below. All right, now I'm actually done. Just thank you.